I call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 134 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Health. Before we begin, I'd like to ask all in-person participants to read the guidelines on the cards on the table. These measures are in place to protect the health and safety of all participants, including the interpreters, and to help prevent audio and feedback incidents. I'd like to in accordance with our routine motion, I'm informing the committee that all remote participants have completed the required connection tests in advance of the meeting. Pursuant to an order of reference adopted by the House of Commons on Wednesday, June 12, 2024, the committee is commencing its clause-by-clause consideration of Bill C-277, an act to establish a national strategy on brain injuries. I'd like to welcome our witness who is available for any content-related questions on the legislation. We also have a couple of experts to my right from the Legislative Council Office, Jean-François Paget and Alexis Labelle, who are here with any procedural or technical questions in connection with the legislation. The witness we have with us, and I'm pleased to welcome, is Michael Collins, Vice President of Health Promotion and Chronic Disease Prevention Branch. Thanks for being with us. I presume you don't have any sort of a statement. You're here for any questions that may arise. Am I correct in that?
You are correct. Yep,
okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I'd like to provide members of the committee with some instructions and a few comments on how the committee will proceed with clause-by-clause consideration of Bill C-277. As the name indicates, this is an examination of all the clauses in the order in which they appear in the bill. I will call each clause successively, and each clause is subject to debate and a vote. If there are amendments to the clause in question, I'll recognize the member proposing it who may explain it. The amendment will then be open for debate. When no further members wish to intervene, the amendment will be voted on. Amendments will be considered in the order in which they appear in the bill or in the package each member received from the clerk. Members should note that amendments must be submitted in writing to the clerk of the committee. I will go slowly to allow members to follow the proceedings properly. If I break that promise, remind me, and I'll slow down. Amendments have been given a number in the top right corner to indicate which party submitted them. There's no need for a seconder to move an amendment. Once moved, you will need unanimous consent to withdraw it. During debate on an amendment, members are permitted to move sub-amendments. These sub-amendments must be submitted in writing. They do not require the approval of the mover of the amendment. Only one sub-amendment may be considered at a time, and the sub-amendment cannot be further amended. When a sub-amendment is moved to an amendment, it is voted on first. Then another sub-amendment may be moved, or the committee may consider the main amendment and vote on it. Once every clause has been voted on, the committee will vote on the title and the bill itself, and an order to reprint the bill may be required if amendments are adopted so that the House has a proper copy for use at report stage. Finally, the committee will have to order the chair to report the bill to the House. That report contains only the text of any adopted amendments as well as an indication of any deleted clauses. All right. So,
Mr. Chair, I believe that there's somebody that is still waiting to be admitted to Zoom, a member from my staff, and it would be important for that person to be able to follow the proceedings.
Okay. Tous les participants ont reçu.
Both participants received 2 links, one for the in-camera and one for the public session. Is it possible that they have perhaps used the wrong link?
Just trying to resolve this technical issue, Mr. Doherty.
Once we come back, I'd like to, if possible, if you'd recognize me for a comment.
Okay.
Thanks.
Mr. Doherty, we haven't suspended. If you have something to say, go ahead.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, it's a rarity that we get a bill or a piece of legislation that we all can come to an agreement that will benefit so many Canadians. What we have before us is a bill that deals with those that are head injured and that are struggling. We heard great testimony at when Mr. McGregor and the witness came forward to defend the bill. And I see these amendments, and while I appreciate the work that goes into these, it is not my first rodeo as well. And I see these amendments only as a source to water down a piece of legislation that is good. And I find that committees always seem to try to perfect legislation and what have you, and that attempt for perfection seems to always water down pieces of good legislation. And I would love to see us move to adopt this piece of legislation without amendments. And of course, I would defer to Mr. McGregor. I can simply go through, a strategy may include measures designed to assist in identifying the training, education, and guidance. We look at these words within 18 months. It is only watering down this legislation. This legislation is good. And it's a rarity where you find us all, us agreeing with our NDP colleagues. And I would like to, I personally would like to thank Mr. McGregor for the work he did on this. As I mentioned before, somebody that has had somebody within my family that struggled and lived with a head injury for a long time. I think this is something that is needed, and I think we should adopt it at all as it is, and really take a look at these. I don't even think we need to look at these amendments. The only serve to water down this piece of legislation. And Mr. Speaker, or Mr. Chair, through you, I don't know whether there is a mechanism to do that. And I think I would move to adopt this as it stands right now and go through that. So through you, Mr. Speaker, I move to adopt the piece of legislation as is, unamended.
I regret to inform you, Mr. Doherty, that your motion is out of order. Under the standing orders, we're obliged to go through clause by clause. As we go through clause by clause, if members find your submissions compelling, they can choose not to move the amendments that they have put on notice, or the committee can choose to vote them down. And the result would be the same, but under the standing orders, we're obliged to do a clause-by-clause examination, so I need to call every individual clause.
Mr. Chair, I get what you're saying, but is there a mechanism where a member can call for a unanimous consent that we adopt, that all committee members agree to adopt a piece of legislation without, as is?
You can do anything by unanimous consent, even though the advice that I've been given is that we have to stick with the standing orders. I mean, So do we have unanimous consent to adopt the bill without amendment? No. We do not. Okay. So, and do we have la joint de monsieur?
Has the staff member been admitted? Yes. Perfect. We are going to start.
5 sub 1, consideration of clause 1. The short title is postponed, and the chair therefore calls clause 2. With clause 2, there is an amendment standing in the name of Mr. Nakvi. Mr. Nakvi, do you wish to move and speak to your amendment?
Thank you, Chair. Do you want me to move the amendment first and then speak to it?
Sure.
Okay. So I move that Bill C-277 in Clause 2 be amended by replacing line 13 on page 1 with the following. Sub 2, the strategy may include measures designed to. That's the amendment that's being suggested, Mr. Chair. It's being proposed to provide greater flexibility to determine the content of the strategy following consultations with provinces and territories, stakeholders, and Indigenous peoples. By having the word shall, it's sort of restricting the consultation process to just the factors that are enumerated in that particular clause, and by having it may, it broadens up, it creates more inclusive and allows for a broader consultation process with the eye of developing the framework. And this engagement should be meaningful and allow for the inclusion of their priorities while keeping in federal jurisdiction as we do the consultations to develop, as we develop the framework as being required by this legislation, if approved. So that's the reason behind the amendment to replace shall with may. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Nakvi. I have a speakers list now on this amendment. Ms. Goodridge, followed by Mr. McGregor and Mr. Doherty. Ms. Goodridge, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We heard it right there. We asked for unanimous consent to try and move forward this very common sense bill on brain injuries, and the Liberals said no to that. We tried to do this, and their position has become very clear in their very first amendment, which is completely watering down the bill and changing a must to a may, which that means that they could decide to not promote the implementation of preventative measures to reduce the risk of brain injuries because they're not required to do so. It means that every single one of the strategy listings that are quite extensive and quite reasonable. We heard it from many stakeholders that they wanted to see this bill passed unamended. We've heard it from Canadians. I've had countless emails from Canadians asking me to pass this unamended, and yet here we have this Liberal government trying to water down this bill to allow them to cherry pick which items they will and won't adhere to in this bill. And I think it is absolutely shameful, and I would urge all of my colleagues to vote against this because this is going to make this bill less effective for Canadians. This is going to make this bill less useful for brain injury people that are surviving with brain injuries and to reduce the risks of brain injuries in general. So I will leave it at that.
Thank you, Ms. Goodridge. Mr. McGregor, please.
Yeah, I'll keep it brief. I also cannot support this amendment. I believe changing the word must is a mistake. I had my staff go through 13 of the briefs, specifically asked for the bill to be passed without amendment. The remaining 21 urged swift passage, had no amendments to offer, only suggestions for the implementation stage. And then of regular correspondence from people with lived experience, none of them expressed a desire to change the bill, only to express support. I do believe that, if you look at the content of the strategy, there's still a lot of flexibility on how the government implements those points. And, we've asked legislative drafters to look at other private members' bills. The use of the word must is a very common phrase. And I just feel, I did take a week to consider this amendment. I just wanted the Liberals to know that, but I'm not prepared to support it. So I will end it there, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. McGregor. Mr. Doherty, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chair. I'm going to try and be as brief as I can, but respecting Mr. Nakvi's amendment, I'm going to substitute the word may for what the bill has. The strategy, instead of saying must include measures designed to, it will say this: the strategy may include measures to promote the implementation of preventive measures to reduce the risk of brain injuries. May. No yes or no, it may. It may identify the training, education, and guidance needs of healthcare and other professionals related to brain injury prevention. It may promote research and improve data collection. It may promote information and knowledge sharing. It may create national guidelines on the prevention. It may promote awareness and education. It may foster collaboration with and provide financial support to national, provincial, and local brain injury associations. It may encourage consultation. It may encourage consultation. Mr. Nakvi's comments and arguments were that the word must will limit consultation. He is simply trying to get out of, the Liberals are simply trying to get out of their responsibilities of what this bill is designed to do and what the original intent is. I'll go down further. It says, may identify challenges resulting from brain injury. Maintain in collaboration. It may maintain in collaboration with Brain Injury Canada. It may establish a task force to include policymakers and stakeholders. This is a common sense bill. The strategy must include these areas and these suggestions here. It's not a may or maybe, it's a must. And that is the reason why. We do not have a national national strategy on brain injuries. If we are not going to take a stand now, why are we doing this? And so I encourage our Liberal colleagues across the way to vote with this this amendment down. There's no gray areas. It's either it must or it won't. May gives it gives the government the ability to skirt their responsibility. And so, Mr. Chair, with all due respect, I'll be voting no on this amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Doherty. Dr. Hanley, please.
First of all, I just want to express my support for the intent of this bill, and I think there is some question over just what is the right legislative language. I just wondered if the legislative clerks might be able to assist with the word must and the interpretation, must versus may versus can versus will, whether there's anything that might be useful to hear from the legislative clerks on that.
Mr. Collins, would you like to take that?
Thank you. Let me be very clear. I am not a legislative drafter in this particular context that I'm here. I'm coming from the Public Health Agency of Canada and administering a series of programs that we have actively in this space, which complements, which this bill builds on. So I would want to refrain, I think, from wading in on the will, must, what have you in this context. At the end of the day, as a public servant, I will abide by the will of the committee and Parliament in terms of whichever way this goes. My final point would be, yes, there was a recognition that there is some complexity within in terms of jurisdictional issues and PTs and the need for Indigenous engagement, which previous witnesses have testified to. So there was some sense that underneath this, and the very, very good will here, there was some complexity.
Okay, thank you, sir. The folks from the Legislative Council office advised me that they're here on matters of procedure and are not comfortable answering this question unless you've had a change of heart, Mr. Paget. Okay, no, still feel the same way. Dr. Pawlowski wants in on this.
Yeah,
but you've got a couple of your colleagues ahead of you on the speaking order. Yes, I know that. I know.
Life actually wrote legislation for World Health Organization. I want to say that the change is exceedingly significant, and may means very much, what it means is very much different from what shall means. And legislative writers, when they're writing, certainly pay attention to the difference between may and shall. It's a pivotal change, and for that reason, I will vote against it.
Mr. Naqvi, please.
I just want to make a couple of points. First of all, start with a very fundamental point that the government supports this legislation. We are very much in favor of this legislation, and will be voting in support of this legislation. Number two, I want to congratulate Mr. McGregor for the work that he has done in bringing forward this legislation. And I also want to thank him for his collaboration. I've had several opportunities to meet with him, to work with him, and his thoughtfulness in making sure that he's bringing a piece of legislation that actually improves the lives of many Canadians. Even to the point of discussing these amendments ahead of time with Mr. McGregor, so there are no surprises, and it's only fair to have difference of opinions. This is the setting we operate in. The last point I will make, Chair, is that the purpose of committees, especially clause by clause, is to go through every clause to look at possible ways of improving. We may have difference of opinion whether that improves a piece of legislation or not. And so the fact that this process is happening does not in any way deviates from the support for the legislation, the outcomes it is going to achieve. But what it does is actually helps, improves this legislation, and of course, democratically we'll decide that. The very last point, which is, I'm also a lawyer, and I've also have helped draft legislation, served in a role as the Attorney General in province where I've reviewed a lot of draft legislation. And yes, please do drink some water. Please, may and shall or must does have a difference, and what the term may does is opens the opportunity to take in far more other factors than enumerated in legislation. You can ask any legislative drafter, will tell you that terms like shall and must constrains you, it restricts you to factors that are enumerated, and use of may, especially in this context when you are outlining several factors, allows you, as consultations are taking place with provinces and territories, with Indigenous peoples, that other factors that they may outline which are not enumerated could also be added. So it's only in that spirit that I'm suggesting the amendment to may, not to water it down, but to ensure that there's an opportunity by a mechanism of consultation to not miss any other factors that may not be enumerated in this clause currently. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Naqvi. Ms. Sidhu, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think I was on the speaking list before, but Mr. Naqvi made the point. We are absolutely in favor of this bill. I just want to put on the record. And the second thing, I think it's committee's job to look into the amendments, bring forward the amendments. That is what our job, and that is what we are doing. Thank you.
Mr. Doherty, please.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Well, first off, Mr. Naqvi, nobody believes you. Whether it is, I'm just stating the obvious. You waxed on for well, there you go. At least you have that going for you. Yeah, you should be.
Yeah.
This is a piece of legislation that you are attempting to water down. It is very clear. I may have a drink of water, or I must have a drink of water. If my doctor said you may have a drink of water, or you must have a drink of water, I shall have a drink of water. I must have a drink of water. you're definitely trying to water this down. There's no two ways about it. I would ask, Mr. Speaker, through you, that we call the vote. I don't know if there's more on the speakers list. I am not trying to filibuster this. It may seem like it. I'm only trying to fight for it, actually, which I think it's a common sense piece of legislation. And I just think that, again, they're wordsmithing. They're trying to play, not they, I won't lump everybody into that, but Mr. Nakvi is trying to skirt or at least provide the government, the Liberal government, a gray area where they may or may not follow through with their responsibility. Mr. Speaker, I would ask that you call the vote.
I'll call the vote as soon as the speakers list is exhausted. Monsieur Thériault, et puis Dr.
Oui.
Pawlowski. Monsieur Thériault,
Merci, Monsieur
vous
le
la
Président.
parole.
Quand je lis
Thank you, Chair. When I look at the French, we see la stratégie prévoit, so the strategy must include measures. Perhaps the French is more neutral in its intention. The strategy, if we say the strategy includes measures, we don't need must or may, it simply includes. I just wanted to raise the difference between the French and English versions. My vote depends on my amendment. So we have 4 changes to discuss. That's very few. And we can get through it fairly quickly. And I have an important amendment to respect provincial and federal jurisdiction. That's why I think we need to get through all of these changes now. And I will likely vote with Mr. McGregor.
Thériault, Dr. Pawlowski, please.
Well, I'm not changing my vote, and I very much understand and think the difference between must and may is highly significant. However, in defense of Mr. Nakvi, I think like all these measures which are listed would certainly be part of a brain injury strategy. I don't think that the government or Mr. Nakvi, in using the word may, put it in there in order to try to give the government flexibility to take some of these things out, because without these things, it would basically be a pretty hollow bill. So I do not think that's at all the intent of Mr. Nakvi's recommendations, but I do appreciate the difference, and I think the importance of using. I'm kind of surprised it's not shall, but must's okay with me, and I would prefer to leave that in.
Seeing no further interventions, we'll now proceed to the question. Is it the will of the committee to proceed by show of hands, or do we require a standing vote?
Oh, let's do a recorded division.
A recorded division has been requested, Madam Clerk.
Mr. Henley.
To be clear, the question for you is whether Amendment G1 shall pass.
I don't support.
Madame Kayabaga.
No.
Mr. Nakvi.
Yes.
Mr. Pawlowski.
No.
Ms. Sidu.
No.
Mr. Duarte.
No.
Mr. Ellis.
No.
Ms. Goodrich.
No.
Mr. Moore.
No.
Monsieur Thériault.
No.
Mr. McGregor.
No.
Yea 1, nays 10.
So the amendment is therefore defeated, and then that brings us to the next amendment on clause 2, qui est proposé par le Bloc québécois.
which is moved by the bloc. Monsieur Thériault, please share the amendment with us. I'll read it first. That Bill C-277 in Clause 2 be amended by replacing line 16 on page 1 with the following. B. Assist in identifying the training, education, and guidance. I said it a little earlier when talking about this bill. There's a difference between determining the needs when it's of provincial jurisdiction, but this strategy will be effective once everyone feels involved and wants to work together, and so that is why I believe we should say that we will assist in identifying the training. I think that it will be much better received by our partners to achieve positive results. Thank you, Mr. Thériault.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I'm actually okay with this amendment. I think if we want to try and keep some harmony and recognize provincial jurisdiction, it's still keeping the bulk of the language for B, and if we're going to force the federal government to assist in identifying that training, education, and guidance, I can live with that.
Mr. Doherty, did you?
I would agree with Mr. McGregor and Mr. Thériault's explanation. I have a better understanding what his intent was, so I would agree with that.
Any further submissions? Are we ready for the question? Shall BQ1 be adopted? L'amendement BQ est-il adopté?
Is Amendment BQ1 adopted?
Je vois le consentement.
I believe that we have agreement in the room. It is carried.
Government Amendment G2, and then standing in the name of Mr. Nakfi. Do you wish to present G2, Mr. Nakfi?
Thanks, Chair. I move that Bill C-277 in Clause 2 as amended by A, replacing lines 13 and 14 on page 2 with the following. Sub G, foster collaboration with national, provincial, and local brain injury. B, replacing line 16 on page 2 with the following. VELOP, which is the end of develop, enhanced and integrated mental. C, replacing lines 30 to 34 on page 2 with the following. Sub J, develop and publish online resources, provide current facts, research, and best practices related to brain injuries. And so there's three changes here, Mr. Chair, that I'll speak to. This amendment is being proposed to remove provisions that would encroach on, again, provincial and territorial jurisdiction or legislate specific financial support. Typically, when you look at bills like this, when you're creating guidelines, it is important to create the framework, but when the framework is created, then you determine the needs of the funding, what kind of funding is needed in what amount, and then that funding, of course, through the usual process of approving funding through Treasury Board, et cetera, is approved. There's few examples. Most recently, that was the process that was followed. For example, the firefighter health bill that MP Romanado had brought forward followed the same process. The framework on autism, I think it was MP Lake who had brought forward that. Very similar process was followed in that case. In the diabetes strategies that MP Sidhu brought forward it was done in a similar way. So this is keeping and making it very much aligned with the practice that has been pursued in this type of bills. The other change that's been proposed in 2.2G is to remove the requirement, as I mentioned, around the financial support so that we can determine what's needed. Additionally, we are proposing that in 22J, we amend to remove reference to maintain a national website in collaboration with Brain Injury Canada. The purpose behind that is it's highly unusual to indicate or highlight one organization, as the case here with Brain Injury Canada, simply from the perspective of what in some years from now, Brain Injury Canada does not exist, or they change their name, or they amalgamate with another organization. And it's probably more prudent to make reference to organizations that deal with brain injury in a more general way, so that we don't run into a situation where the legislation feels obsolete or does not speak to what the reality is, or highlight just one specific entity. So the attempt in this amendment is to remove a specific reference to Brain Injury Canada and make the language more general in terms of organizations that work in that space. Lastly, we're proposing that a national website be replaced with online resources, and again, to make the language more inclusive so that could be flexibility on all kinds of resources, including a website, of course, that could provide the information that has been referenced to. Once again, I want to say that I've spoken to Mr. McGregor about these changes, and we've had a discussion around that, as well as to the reason why these amendments are being proposed. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Naqvi. Mr. McGregor, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I have submitted a sub-amendment to this amendment to the clerk, so I'll give the signal if that can start being distributed to committee members. Before I read the sub-amendment, I just want to address the arguments that Mr. Naqvi made. We have checked with Legislative Council and with the original drafters. In their response, they said subsection 22G is drafted such that the government would not be legally bound to providing financial support. The bill provides that the Minister of Health must develop a strategy that sets out measures that are designed to provide financial support. It's akin to requiring the minister to make a plan to do X, but not making the minister actually do X. If there was such a binding requirement on the government to fund, the legislative clerks would have concluded that the bill would have required a royal recommendation. So for that reason, my sub-amendment, and before I move the sub-amendment, I do agree with the concerns that were raised about naming Brain Injury Canada. So the sub-amendment that I submitted to the clerk, I am simply moving that we delete both A and B in Amendment G2. C would be replaced with language that says develop, publish, and maintain is the key change, maintain online resources providing current facts, research, and best practices related to brain injuries. And so I'm essentially moving to remove 2/3 of G2's amendment, but keep the change that is identified in Part C, and I'll conclude there, Mr. Chair.
The sub-amendment is in order, except that it has not yet been translated into French. So I think the appropriate measure would be to suspend until we have a French version, and then we will begin debate on the sub-amendment. Okay, so we are suspended. I would hope that. Okay, a few minutes. So we're suspended for 5 minutes. Thank you. I call the meeting back to order. We're now back in session, and you should have now in your email box the sub-amendment in both official languages. I have Ms. Goodridge and Mr. Doherty on the speaker's list, so I recognize Ms. Goodridge. On the sub-amendment, please.
I thank you, Mr. Chair. I think this is a very common sense sub-amendment. It actually addresses the concern I brought to Mr. McGregor at the end of his meeting, and I think that he did a spectacular job at developing a solution. I think that this is absolutely great, and I urge everyone to vote for it.
Mr. Doherty?
Mr. Chair, to Mr. Nakvi's comment, I too had the same concern regarding a private member's bill that had financial ramifications for the government or responsibilities for the government. I take Mr. McGregor's comment and understand that, and I would vote in favor of the sub-amendment as well, too.
Any further discussion on the sub-amendment proposed by Mr. McGregor? Mr. Thériault, s'il vous plaît.
La suppression de l'alinéa A.
For A, are we talking about this document? It's G2. If we remove G2, which pertains to B in the bill, what would happen with my amendment?
OK. OK, parfait. Excellent.
I understand. And all that we'd be doing is changing foster collaboration and maintain collaboration. Are there any other questions or comments?
Interventions, seeing none, are we ready for the question on the sub-amendment? All those in favor of the sub-amendment as presented, please raise your hand. It appears to be unanimous. The sub-amendment is therefore adopted, and now we move to the amendment G2 as sub-amended.
Oui. Est-ce que, M. le Président, pourrait le lire?
would it be possible to read it in French, please?
Donc, dans la version française, à J, là, de ce côté de G2,
It would be read, create and maintain resources online to share best practices on brain injuries.
D'accord. Any other interventions with respect to the amendment as subamended, G2 as subamended? Seeing none, ready for the question? All those in favor of G2 as subamended, raise your hand. Are those opposed? The amendment is carried as subamended. Brings us that concludes the amendments that have been brought forward for G2. So the question for the committee now is, shall Clause 2, as amended, carry? It's carried. That brings us to Clause 3, and we have one amendment proposed for Clause 3. It's G3 in the name of Mr. Nakvi. Mr. Nakvi, do you wish to move and speak to that amendment?
Thanks, Chair. Yes, the motion is that Bill C-277 in Clause 3 be amended by replacing line 1 on page 3 with the following: 3 sub 1 within 18 months after the day on which this act. Chair, the simple purpose behind this amendment is, again, to create a flexibility in time for the appropriate work that needs to happen in order to develop this important framework. It allows for that flexibility up to 18 months as opposed to just 12 months to do the appropriate engagement with provinces, territories, Indigenous peoples, and other stakeholders, and ensuring that jurisdiction given healthcare is of province, and administration of healthcare is provincial and territorial jurisdiction, that the Government of Canada is appropriately engaging those entities and Indigenous communities in developing this national strategy. So that flexibility and timeline will be helpful. And once again, I have discussed this change with Mr. McGregor and explained to him the reason behind saying within 18 months as opposed to just 12 months to create that time flexibility. Thank you.
Ms. Goodridge?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's just another example of the Liberals trying to gut this bill and make it harder. I don't understand. It's reasonable. 12 months is a reasonable amount of time, and it forces the government to get to work quickly on this. And so this is something that we've unanimously agreed should go forward. We've unanimously passed this. We do not understand the difference 6 months would make. And so I want to see the government not sit on their heels and wait for this, and instead get to work immediately so that we have this. And having a 12-month deadline makes it so that they have to act quickly and they can't dither. So I will be opposing this.
Thank you. Mr. McGregor?
Yeah, I mean, Mr. Nakvi, like when you and I had conversations about this, I did understand like the reasoning you were putting forward, and I did, at that time sort of give some signs of favorability to number 3, but I think over the weekend and leading up to today's meeting, I've had some second thoughts on it. I think I've kind of been persuaded by some of the arguments that my Conservative colleagues have put forward. I do think, if I look at the actual wording of the bill, the Minister of Health must prepare a report setting out the strategy and cause it to be tabled I mean, I know there's a lot in there, but Health Canada commands a lot of resources. The Public Health Agency of Canada commands a lot of resources, and I think that people living with brain injuries have been waiting quite a long time. So I think I am going to maintain my position that the way the bill is currently written is what I'd like to see.
Thank you, Mr. McGregor. Mr. Doherty, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Look, again, it's either a priority or it isn't. At the end of the day, it's 6 months that we're talking. Mr. Nakvi's talking. This is either a priority for this government or it will be a priority when we form government in the next election. And so I would offer that the excuse that, or the argument, sorry, that Mr. Nakvi has given about consultation, about making sure that they dot their I's and cross the T's and get this right again, is just an opportunity for them to delay and dither, as my colleague had mentioned, and far be it for me to go rogue on this. That's an inside joke for one of our assistants said that we were going rouge and meant rogue. But I would offer this, the hesitation and that we are having in accepting Mr. Nakvi's changes to this. I would hope that should this amendment be amended or be rejected, that this bill, out of spite and Mr. Nakvi's anger at the frustration that his amendments aren't being passed, I would hope that this doesn't flavor whether the government supports or doesn't support post committee appearance. Our colleagues have been in support of it, and I would hope that the fact that a couple of their amendments did not pass does not flavor their final vote on this bill, because this is a common sense bill. Again, whether it's 18 months or it's a year, let's get this done. Canada does not have a national brain injury strategy, and Mr. Nakvi, you could have the legacy of actually being the first government to do that, or you could have the legacy of dithering and delaying it. And so I'll leave that with you, Mr. Chair, and I will be voting against this amendment.
Ms. Sidhu, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First point, we'll support this bill regardless. The second point is this: to properly engaging with the patients, with all the stakeholders, with all communities, Indigenous communities, and plus this is not the Health Canada. This is something we have to talk to provincial partners, territories. So I think it's what Mr. Nakvi is proposing. It's a fair amount of time, 18 months. That's what I want to say. Thank you.
Dr. Hanley and then Dr. Pawlowski.
Yeah, look, I just had more or less the same comments as my colleague, Ms. Sidhu. I think we just had to be pragmatic. This is about supporting the implementation of this really important bill. I think if there's a legacy from this committee is that we have unanimous support for this bill going forward. It's really just about a practical implementation. So I support the amendment.
Dr. Pawlowski?
Having amended or rejected the amendment, which would change must to may, the government must do all these things. It's a pretty lengthy list with a lot of consultation. There are 10 provinces, 3 territories, Indigenous groups. And you know what? I mean, I think you guys will all appreciate the fact that organizing meetings, especially in different parts of the country, is going to take some amount of time. People aren't always available. Times aren't convenient. And since we must do this, if we're going to do a good job, I think adding another 6 months is not that onerous and would perhaps make for a better strategy. So I support the proposed amendment.
Mr. Thériault?
Oui, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. If we follow what Mr. Doherty has said, there could be an election in the spring. And if I was a conservative, I would want the time to implement this national strategy. If we follow that logic and swap seats, well, there might be a transfer of power that might have to happen. And when we legislate, we don't factor in partisan arguments, but we do want to factor in reality. Sharing this strategy with all of the provinces and territories, well, I can say that the federal government is not well perceived in Quebec, and it took a year to sign agreements on health transfers. Well, perhaps a change in government would mean things would go better, but I haven't heard about any more commitment from the Conservatives regarding increasing health transfers. Also, Quebec is going through a reform, has got a lot on its plate, and so having a national strategy with the Ministry of Health would take a lot of work. And if the time is limited, well, the efforts might fail. We have to factor in political realities. We're dealing with real-life policies here. So, what's important is for this bill to move forward quickly and to move through the Senate quickly. And we know that sometimes the Senate deals with private members' bills as it wishes. But we want to send this to the Senate as quickly as possible for it to pass before an election is triggered. This strategy needs to happen in collaboration. It's written in this bill. It is necessary. And it requires time. Whether we're talking about 12 or 18 months, well, the Bloc wants to act in the interest of Canadians, is not obsessed by power, and so our goal is to serve the interests of patients and people. And we want to be realistic. I don't think that 12 months is realistic. That's my comment.
Mr. McGregor, did you have an intervention? You have the floor.
Yeah, just very quickly. Like, I understand the rationale. It's just that my change in heart comes from the fact that the brain injury community has been waiting for so long, and you know, the process with this bill is not closed. Like, this meeting right now is happening in public. This bill has been on the public record. I guess that's all to say that the government, if we're having such unanimous support with this bill, then the government right now is aware of what's coming its way. So the government doesn't actually have to wait to start getting prepared. If it can read the tea leaves and understands that this bill stands a very good chance of passing, then maybe some of that preparation work can happen. So I do understand the government's position on wanting more time. I'm just trying to hold firm for the brain injury community who just have been waiting for so long. That's just why I've had my change of heart, Mr. Chair. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Mr. Doherty, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and bless you. I appreciate Mr. McGregor's comments, and that is the sole reason why I'm imploring this committee and our colleagues across the way to consider it, and why I said earlier on, it's either a priority or it isn't. The brain injury group, as I said earlier on, we as a committee, as Mr. Hanley had mentioned, our legacy can be that we have adopted a piece of legislation, got it back to the House, passed it unanimously. For the very first time, Canada can have a piece of legislation calling on the government to develop a national brain injury strategy, which I think is so important. It has never happened before, and through successive governments, it has been asked for. It's not the first time it's been asked for, but it is the first time it's gotten to this point where we have a piece of legislation that, by all appearances, has unanimous support. I would implore our colleagues across the way, in the spirit of collaboration, and perhaps Mr. Ackley will see his way to withdraw his amendment and keep it at a year, because if it is a priority, the government, whether, again, I'll say it, whether it's this government or the next government or whoever, if it's a priority now, when we're all saying it is, let's get to work and get it done.
Mr. Nakvi, please.
Thank you, Chair. And I agree with Mr. McGregor's point that that brain injury community has been wanting to have a framework in place for some time, and rightly so. They've been doing some really important work. But what I've also heard from them, that they want a good strategy, a thoughtful strategy, a strategy that actually is going to work, and we cannot let them down or disappoint them by rushing into a strategy. This is not about resources at Health Canada. Of course, Health Canada will do the work as required if this legislation is passed into law. It's also making sure that consultations that is being asked for in this legislation with provinces and territories, with community organizations, with Indigenous communities, is done properly. We cannot expect that they will have all the same resources. I often hear from my colleagues, especially from Conservatives, about doing appropriate consultations and making sure that we're talking to the provinces and territories. And that work is really important work. And for this strategy to work appropriately, we need to make sure that that work is done thoroughly. Not all provinces or territories are the same size, have the same capacity. Indigenous communities, there are many other files that they've been consulted with. So keeping all that in mind, agreeing with Mr. Thériault on this point, this is not about lack of priority or resources. This is about making sure that we get this done right, and have a timeline in place that is practical, which will result in a strategy that is going to help Canadians and loved ones, help people with suffering from brain injury. Thank you.
Mr. Nakvi, Ms. Kayabaga, please.
Thank you, Chair. I put up my hand to say exactly what my colleague has said. The provinces and territories are being consulted right now on many different priorities. And as Yasser, my colleague, has very well stated, some of them have less capacity than others, and as well as Indigenous organizations. So I think the time frame here is to be able to accommodate and to make sure that this is done right across the country. Thank you.
Are there any further interventions with respect to Amendment G3? Mr. Doherty?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And perhaps I misdirected my comments. Perhaps I should be speaking directly to Mr. Thériault, and I would agree that collaboration must take place with all the provinces. But we have seen pieces of legislation where this government has said that they will collaborate, they will work through and speak to all the stakeholders, provinces and what have you. And what have we seen over the last 9 years that they have not done that, whether it's 12 months, 18 months, or a rushed piece of legislation. I would ask and implore and see that you are, Mr. Terrio is essentially the kingmaker here in terms of this piece of legislation. His vote matters with this piece of legislation. It matters all the time, but it makes a difference whether it is 12 months or 18 months. I would ask through you, Mr. Chair, that Mr. Terrio reconsiders where his vote is going to land on this, and this is an opportunity for us to once again send a message to this to the government that this matters and it is a priority, and we can get to work doing it right away. The proponent for the bill, Mr. McGregor, has stated that why it is so important that we get to work on this. It's a rare chance where opposition comes together in recent months and years to defend a piece of legislation that another opposition party has put forward. This is an amendment. I get it. I understand. I've had pieces of legislation myself, and I've agreed to that time frame, and I've defended pieces of legislation that has gone forward, or not defended, but I've argued pieces of legislation where the government has said that they've consulted and they've done on the work, and we know that they haven't. So regardless of whether it's 12 months or 18 months, we know that they're going to miss it. But we know that if we send a message today to the brain injury group that we have held firm in what the initial drafting of this piece of legislation was, and that we are saying, let's get to work on this. It sends a message to the government that get your house in order and get going on it, and true collaboration. That also can be directed, should they choose, to work collaboratively with the proponent of the piece of legislation, which is what we did when we had our national framework on post-traumatic stress disorder. We worked with the government and how our framework was going to roll out. So there are opportunities with that. So I would leave it at that, and I would ask that Mr. Terrio perhaps would reconsider. It's one last piece of amendment, and on this piece of bill, and hopefully we can move forward with it. Thank you.
Monsieur Terrio, s'il vous plaît.
Oui, bien, Monsieur le Président, je n'ai...
Mr. Chair, I want to have something that is good for people with brain injuries. It's not in deciding on 12 months that we would have a perfect strategy in 12 months. The real issue is whether or not this receives royal assent before an election, and the Conservatives are currently asking for an election every day. And if we were to decide to move to an election, we'd have to say to these people that there won't be a national strategy. That's also what this means. And that's the real deadline. It's not a theoretical deadline. Perhaps Mr. Ellis will be health minister, and I'd be ready to say, yeah, 12 months. And I'll rise in the House and remind him about the 12 months. The Bloc looks at policies differently, and we know that in Quebec there is an issue at different levels on collaboration and on health. Mr. Chair, I don't want to take too much time, but when we traveled for the opioid crisis, we had spoken to different institutions, and the Quebec government, through a deputy minister, stated that we could not be present in a certain place, and you're aware of this. They didn't want us in their space. That's what's happening between Quebec and Ottawa. And now we have a national strategy that we want to implement in the next 12 months. So let's say we reach the end, but we'd be in an election at the end of that. We wouldn't be focusing on we wouldn't be working on the strategy. Everyone would be in election mode. So we're having a theoretical discussion here right now. If it makes people happy, well, they need to be aware that that's not the real deadline. The real deadline is whether or not we're going to move to an election and we're going to lose this bill. The Conservatives have 125 questions per week during question period, and not a single question has been asked for the Senate to put pressure on the Liberals when they did it with another bill. It's possible that this bill will not move forward before an election, and we won't have supply management, and there are people who need help. But I want people to understand that we are working to help people. I think it would be difficult to respect 12 months. But if I were opportunistic and doing politics, I would say let's do 12 months and we'll rise in the House and we'll tell the Conservatives that they did not keep their word, and we'll pull up the Hansard and ask them what they're waiting on to put the strategy, to implement the strategy.
Mentions with respect to Amendment G3. Dr. Ellis, please.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. It's an opportunity that we have to respect the provincial jurisdiction. I've spoken with the Health Minister in Quebec, and that was the first topic of our conversation, respecting Quebec's jurisdiction and that of the other provinces as well. I think it is very important. That's the importance that the Conservatives give to provincial jurisdiction. This bill will be a priority for Conservatives if we were to win the next election. But it might not be the case. But the issue with senators now, it's motions, privilege motions, and the problem with those, as you know, Monsieur Thériault, is that the Liberals do not want to give all of the information to the House. It's okay to give incomplete information, but we need fulsome information to make decisions. That's the issue now. With this bill, we could hope to have a bill in 12 months, and I think that we need to work for that. For all Canadians who are watching the committee now, we can't say that it'll take 18 months. Canadians want to know that it takes 12 months to help these people who have brain injuries. That is why we need to adopt the bill as written by Mr. McGregor and say that 12 months is enough. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Thériault. I just want to repeat that the main issue, and there are people who want this strategy as quickly as possible and with good reason. We need to ensure that the Senate does not drag its feet with this bill, and we have no control over the Senate, apparently. The Senate does not prioritize private members' bills, and Mr. Ellis raised an issue that the House is not currently looking at any bills. How long will that last? Thankfully, if there's prorogation, the bill isn't lost, but if there's an election, C-277 is gone. And we need to say that to people. People need to know it. And that's the real deadline here. And we need to say it so that people understand the reality. Saying that the government does not want to act in 12 months, that's not it. The real issue is there going to be an election? And if we do, and there's a change in government, the time that it will take for the machine to restart, the time that we're back in the House, the time that we table this bill, if the Senate fast tracks it, which I highly doubt. We need to know if the Senate is ready to fast track it before triggering an election. If that's the case, that's fine. I'll support. And I want to support this just to show that it's bound to fail. But I don't want to mislead Canadians. I don't want to mislead the people who are waiting on this strategy. I think it's just important to be honest. And I also have contacts in the Quebec government. But currently, well, an election can change everything. And I would like to remind my Liberal colleagues that the 29th is Monday. So that's all I had to say.
Any further interventions? Seeing none, are we ready for the question? The question is, shall G3 carry? All those in favor, hands please. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Est-ce que G3
Will G3 be carried?
okay. And those opposed to G3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, Baggy voted with the Liberals, okay. I count 6, 5. Therefore, the amendment is adopted. That brings us then to Clause 3 as amended. Any interventions with respect to Clause 3 as amended? Seeing none, shall Clause 3 carry? Clause 3 is carried. Shall that brings us to Clause 4. Any interventions with respect to Clause 4? Seeing none, shall Clause 4 carry? I see consensus. Clause 4 is carried. The short title, shall the short title carry? I see consensus. The short title is carried. Shall the title carry? Carried. Shall the bill as amended carry? The bill is carried. Shall the chair report the bill as amended to the House? That's carried. Shall the committee order a reprint of the bill as amended for the use of the House at report stage? That's carried. Thank you, colleagues. Thank you, Mr. Collins. Mr. McGregor has something to say. Go ahead.
Just very briefly, I just really want to thank all members of this committee. Truly, the brain injury community is watching, and this is a really big day for them. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much for all of your work on this bill.
Thank you, Mr. McGregor, and congratulations. So that concludes a clause-by-clause review of Bill C-277. Mr. Collins, you are free to spend the rest of your day doing something equally interesting if you so desire. Thanks for being with us. Our agenda calls now for us to move into camera to consider the draft report. So
Mr. Chair?
I'm inclined to suspend the meeting unless unless somebody has something to say before I do. Mr. Doherty.
Mr. Chair, it is 5:21. There's not enough time to suspend and then get into the details of this. I would move to adjourn and then take this up at the next available chance that we can.
Is it the will of the committee to adjourn the meeting? I see consensus. Thank you, Mr. Doherty. We're adjourned.